Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another live stream, and thank you so much for tuning in for another show. Iran is preparing huge drills in case it's going to be attacked by Israel, with more warnings today coming from the American President Donald Trump that such an attack might happen very soon, and more severe moves coming from the United States, like the evacuation of some of their staff inside of Israel. Also, there was a very severe warning coming from Steve Witkoff. And what's becoming clear now, at least from the statements that are coming from the United States administration officials, is that something can happen. There is a very high likelihood that something can happen. So Iran is on the highest alert. Iran is totally ready. From an Israeli perspective, they're not saying much, but there are certain statements that have been made today by the Israeli IDF chief of staff that show that not all of them view what's happening now and the approach of Benjamin Netanyahu the same. There was a clear message being sent by the IDF chief of staff that not many people close to Netanyahu really liked. We're going to talk all about that in this live stream and the prospect of something happening either this week or even next week, with more reports coming from Israel, by the way, that they could be putting on hold any such attack up until the last round of negotiations between the United States and Iran. The big problem is no date has been confirmed so far, and as a matter of fact, there are growing hostilities between Iran and the United States and the IAEA, especially in relation to the latest moves being taken against Iran. Iran is claiming that some of these moves are being politicized deliberately against them, and these are raising more statements that came from Iran previously about the potential assassination of the previous head of the IAEA, who was more neutral, whereas this one, especially with the leaked documents that we'll also be talking about from Iran, is showing that he is more pro-Israeli. And as a matter of fact, he handed Israel information about the Iranian scientists, the same scientists or some of the same scientists that were assassinated later on in Iran. There was a very long period of scientists being assassinated very suspiciously in Iran, and this is raising more and more questions about the motives of the IAEA as an organization, how neutral it really is, and raises questions about the actual pressure being applied, because there are other pressures being applied and we can see them. There's a very long history of pressure being applied on people in senior positions to adhere to the American and Israeli interests. So we will begin with the actions that are coming from Iran. Iran is conducting a huge military drill, and this time they're saying it's aimed at enhancing defense capabilities and deterrence. Chief of Staff of the Iranian Armed Forces Major General Mohammad Hossein Baqir on Thursday issued an order to commence military drills codenamed Iqtidar, or Power 1404. He also said that the purpose is to, of course, enhance their capabilities and assess their readiness. Now, from an Iranian perspective, they already stated multiple times that they're ready, and they have been ready for years. But now they're taking more precautionary measures to prepare for any such an attack coming from Israel. And they have multiple scenarios ready. Iran has scenarios that depend heavily on the Israeli attack, whether it will be an attack against military positions, whether it will be, or an attack on its nuclear facilities, or an attack on the oil facilities or strategic locations. And Iran has all of the strategic missiles already aimed at those targets in Israel, depending on which plan they want to implement in the final attack that they conducted against Israel, or retaliatory attack against the Israeli aggression against Iran. All of their missiles landed, and they used hypersonic missiles. All of them landed, and most of them targeted military bases in Israel, primarily the Nevatim base, which is the base that is expected to be used as the primary hub for Israel to launch an attack against Iran. Iran very carefully chose that specific base, and Iran will most likely attack that base. Now, the IRGC, they also made a statement, and they said that from an Iranian perspective, they are prepared for any scenario coming against their country, whether it's a case of an attack from the United States, an attack from the United States from Israel, or an attack from Israel on its own. The chief commander of the Islamic Revolution Guards Corps said that the enemy sometimes threaten us with military action. We have always said and repeat now that we are fully prepared for any scenario under any circumstances. They could not stand up against the Yemeni youth and were crushed. How can they possibly confront a great nation like Iran? He said, again reiterating the fact that Iran is ready for an attack, not just from Israel, but a coordinated attack from Israel and the United States too. Now, the United States, we were speaking about yesterday the reports that came about the United States sending evacuation messages to families of diplomatic staff and families of military personnel in bases across the Middle East. And those were clearly serious. We're talking about Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the UAE, potentially extended to Saudi Arabia with certain suspicious moves as well. But now the United States is also issuing a statement for its staff in Israel. So there was this report in Israeli media. U.S. Embassy issues extraordinary warning, they called it in Israeli media. Employees are prohibited from leaving Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Beit Shemesh areas. The United States Embassy in Israel issued a security alert to its employees stating that due to increasing regional tensions, government employees in Israel are not permitted to travel outside the greater Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Beersheba area. According to the announcement, it is permitted to travel between these areas, as well as to travel to Ben Gurion Airport via Highway 1 and the Allenby Crossing. So the threat or the moves that are being taken by the United States administration are not limited only to the areas that they think Iran will hit in the Gulf states, but also inside of Israel. Clearly, Benjamin Netanyahu hinted that he will be attacking, and based on the previous pattern of behavior coming from Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu, especially after certain pressure was applied from Steve Witkoff and the United States administration for Israel to reach a ceasefire, for example, or like what Donald Trump told Benjamin Netanyahu recently, you need to end the war, that's it. And Benjamin Netanyahu did not listen. Well, they know that Benjamin Netanyahu can potentially go on an attack without the consent of the United States. Not only that, Steve Witkoff is also threatening now or warning from the potential of having mass casualties inside of Israel. He said that, well, there could actually be a massacre inside of Israel if Iran attacks the country. He warned of a potential massacre if Israel strikes Iran. So Steve Witkoff sending this statement and the United States evacuating its staff in Israel or sending this warning, then the United States having all of these moves coming in the Gulf states to remove staff and diplomatic missions and families of military personnel, that means that they're serious. And this statement from Witkoff is not to be taken lightly. The Iranian response to Iran, the Iranian response to the Israeli strike would be a mass casualty event, he told multiple officials. Now, they're threatening, they're warning, they're taking action on the ground. They're not declaring that they will be participating. However, all of that is happening. Clearly, something is happening. There are genuine warnings and genuine threats. Now, Donald Trump, he also made statements. He made two statements today. One of them, well, two of them related to Iran, and they had certain similarities and certain differences too. Let's begin with the first statement that Donald Trump made today.
Yes, a question from Newsmax. Could you provide an update on Iran? We're hearing reports that U.S. personnel are being moved out of the region within striking distance.
Well, they are being moved out because it could be a dangerous place, and we'll see what happens. But they are being, we've given notice to move out. We'll see what happens.
Is there anything that can be done to dial the temperature down in the region?
They can't have a nuclear weapon. Very simple. They can't have a nuclear weapon. We're not going to allow that.
So that was the first statement that came from Donald Trump, but there was another statement that he made when he was asked about the subject. Let's hear what he said in the other statement.
Well, I don't want to say imminent, but it looks like it's something that could very well happen. Look, it's very simple, not complicated. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Other than that, I want them to be successful. I want them to be tremendous. We'll help them be successful. We'll trade with them. We'll do whatever is necessary. Well, I don't want to say imminent, but it looks like it's something that.
So you can hear from Donald Trump's tone that, well, number one, he isn't really interested in escalation, at least from what we can hear from him. But two, that there is a genuine prospect here of an escalation, especially with him knowing the nature of Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu has been a man who went against advice coming from the Israeli military, against advice that came from the Israeli Shin Bet, and the popular demand to completely stop the war. But now, amidst all of these reports of a potential attack coming from Israel against Iran, we had a very clear statement coming from the IDF Chief of Staff. The IDF Chief of Staff said that Israel must not attack Iran alone. In the shadow of increasing reports of possible imminent attack on Iran, a dispute emerged today within the Israeli leadership over a question of whether Israel can act alone in Iran. According to the reports, the Chief of Staff has firmly refused to move. So we're talking about a clear-cut refusal from the IDF Chief of Staff for Israel to act on its own against Iran. This leaves no doubt. So what does that tell you? Well, that tells you that the prospect is real. The United States knows something. They are debating it and talking about it in Israel, and they are publishing that the IDF Chief of Staff does not want to participate in an attack with Israel on its own, because he knows that it's almost impossible for Israel to attack Iran. If we want to talk about logistically, if we want to talk about it from a preparedness perspective, if we want to talk about all of the intel, all of the support, all of the information that's needed, Israel indeed cannot carry out an attack on its own against Iran. Now, the big question is, if Benjamin Netanyahu is getting this advice or this move, this statement coming from the IDF Chief of Staff, can he actually go on an attack against Iran despite refusal from the heads of the security establishment in Israel? And the short answer is yes, of course he can. Benjamin Netanyahu was constantly going against the advice of the previous IDF Chief of Staff, Herzi Halevi. He was going against the advice of the Israeli Shin Bet. But if we want to talk about the Israeli army, and one must note here that the advice of the IDF Chief of Staff bears a lot of significance in Israel. So previous prime ministers, if they had, for example, a political agenda or a campaign that they wanted to conduct or a military action, if they would show it, present it to the IDF Chief of Staff, and the IDF Chief of Staff would have certain reservations, they would take it very seriously. They would consider it very heavily. But Benjamin Netanyahu, in the past year and a half, went against multiple advice that was given to him from the IDF chief staff. For example, when Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to expand the genocide to Rafah, the IDF chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, was firmly against it, and he went out publicly against it. And at the time, he said, number one, we need to exhaust all of the political actions that we can before we conduct another military operation in Rafah. Two, we're urgently in need of 7,000 fighters to come and join before we expand the operation into Rafah. Benjamin Netanyahu went against that advice, therefore knowingly and deliberately putting the lives of those he's sending to Gaza at risk because he got an advice contrary to what he wants, against his will, knowing that they might be killed easily in Rafah, knowing that they will not necessarily achieve any significant military objectives. And guess what? Now there's evidence, there's concrete evidence of that now in Rafah, with all of the operations coming from the Palestinian resistance from north to south. Just today, the Palestinian resistance published more of the actions that they're conducting against the genocide forces. And these actions are taking place in Rafah, in Khan Yunis, in Jabalia, and Beit Hanun. So from the northern part of the Gaza Strip to the southern part of the Gaza Strip. And we are talking about areas that are completely destroyed. And if we want to talk about the destruction, the Haaretz published an article today saying that the level of destruction in Rafah, for example, in Jabalia, is more than the level of destruction in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and in the worst hit places in World War II. That's the level of destruction. Yet, miraculously, the Palestinian resistance is still operating heavily in these areas and not raising the white flag. So, Benjamin Netanyahu, he has the capacity to go and conduct an attack against Iran, even if the IDF chief of staff does not want him to, and even if Donald Trump does not want him to, because Benjamin Netanyahu only cares about himself and about his interests and about his political career, dodging the Israeli courts and making sure that he gets what he wants. From an internal perspective, inside of Israel, there were reports today that Israel was preparing emergency measures in several key hospitals in Israel, but there was a lot of censorship about that. And there was also another report that the Israeli Home Front Command, which is responsible of the security internally in case like there's a war, many mayors were asking them, like, what shall we do? Like, but many people are talking about war. Is there going to be a war, or, you know, do we need to take any certain measures? And they came up with this statement today. In light of reports of an Israeli attack on Iran and the appeal of mayors and authorities in the Home Front Command, the IDF spokesman sought to clarify that there is no change in the instructions to the public, and that the instructions given by the Home Front Command through official channels must be followed. Does that mean that there will be no attack? Again, no. Why? Because the Home Front Command previously stated that there are no changes in the orders given in terms of security when there were attacks. And why do they do that? They do that as an act of deception against their enemy, so that they don't show them that we are indeed preparing for an all-out war. And then later on, there were also claims coming from Israel that they're going to potentially delay the attack or any potential attack up until after Sunday next week, in case things move forward between the United States and Israel. Now, moving on to the next thing that I wanted to talk to you about. Egypt is banning international activists from participating in the march to break the siege on the Gaza Strip. Now, what people need to understand is there are two types of activists going to Egypt now. One of them is a convoy, a vehicle convoy that started in Morocco, headed to Algeria, and is now in Libya. The second level of activists, or the other activists, are activists who are going from multiple continents across the world, from America, from Europe, from Algeria, from Morocco, other countries too, going to Cairo and planning to participate with the convoy from there to Rafah. And here's what the Egyptian authorities are doing to them, according to one of the activists who was participating. Let's have a look.
السلام عليكم. لا شك أنكم سمعتم أن السلطات المصرية أرجعت العديد من الناشطين المغاربة الجزائر والأوروبيين الذين ذهبوا إلى القاهرة ليتضامنوا مع غزة وليطالبوا برفع الحصار عنها. وكأحد من هؤلاء أريد أن أشهد على ماذا جرى. إذا بعد وصولنا بتذكرة مطابقة والتأشيرة موجودة وكل شيء على ما يرام، احتجزونا لمدة فوق 3 ساعات. منهم قبلوا دخول بعض الأشخاص، وفي الطائرة ديالنا 12 شخصا أرجعوه. كانت ظروف الاحتجاز فيها كثير من الإرهاب النفسي، يعني وحتى ظروف الإرجاع يعني كانت غير ملائمة. يعني فقط مثل، كانت معنا سيدة مسنة قالت لهم بأن عندها الإنسولين في الحقيبة التي في الطائرة، فلم يريدوا أن يستمعوا إليها. وهنا أريد أن أركز على نقطتين. النقطة الأولى هي أنه عندما تعطي تأشيرة لمواطن أجنبي وعندما بعد استجوابه يعطيك كل التطمينات أنه كيفما كان قرارك في خصوص المسيرة سوف يحترم قوانين البلد، إذا كانت المسيرة سوف يشارك فيها، وإذا لم تكن فسوف يعمل سياحة عادية، ورغم ذلك ترجع بهذه الطريقة المذلة، فهذه ليست طريقة دولة محترمة، بل هي أقرب إلى دولة بلطجية. النقطة الثانية وهي الأهم، هؤلاء الناشطين ما كان لهم أن يأتوا إلى مصر لو كانت مصر قامت بعملها وبواجبها بفك الحصار عن غزة، وعوض حتى بعد أن لم تقم بواجبها منعت الآخرين أن يضغطوا من أجل فك هذا الحصار. والسلام عليكم.
So that was one of the statements that was made by one of the Moroccan activists who was heading towards Egypt, planning to participate in the march towards the Rafah border. And there was also a video published by other activists of how they were treated on the planes. Let's have a look at how they were treated and what they were saying in that video.
What's happening right now, we're being forced into the plane. You can see he has all our passports. This is unbelievable. And the rest of the people are still in the bus.
SD-kaart van 256 gigabyte met allemaal beeldmateriaal is juist.
So massive amounts of security forces, and they are expelling them from Egypt because they wanted to participate. Now, the valid point that came from the Egyptian authorities before, you can consider it a valid point, is, well, they need to coordinate with us and they need to seek approval and all of that stuff. But clearly, as the activists were telling you, everything was coordinated. We had the visas, and we clearly told them that if we would not be participating in that march, if the authorities, for example, decided to stop it, block it, or whatever they decided, because, you know, you can, as a country, you can do whatever you want to do, whether you agree or disagree with them. They treated them as if they were criminals and they deported them from the country. Now, one very symbolic video that popped up was a small comparison, a small comparison of how Egypt allowed an Israeli warship to pass the Suez Canal, an Israeli warship, during the genocide, passing the Suez Canal, and how it was treating the protesters who wanted to go to the Gaza Strip. A warship going to bomb children in Gaza was allowed freely, and the authorities at the time, they said this is due to our international obligations and we have agreements and da. But protesters who had their visas, who clearly told the authorities that we will abide by the law, we won't go against anything from the authorities. If they tell us that, look, we don't want you to go to Rafah, for example, or it would be too risky, it would potentially escalate to a war, whatever it is, they deport them. They treat them like criminals. But they allow Israeli ships to pass through the Suez Canal. And like the activist said, at the end of the day, if Egypt had fulfilled its obligation, at least towards the humanitarian part of the people, by the way, if you don't like go into a war with Israel or whatever it is, feed the people, there wouldn't have been such a massive campaign. That's why the people started to take action. But clearly, from the Egyptian authorities' perspective, they're planning to stop this from going ahead, by the way. And it looks like they're going to stop the vehicle convoy once it arrives to the Egyptian territories. As a matter of fact, the Israeli foreign minister, he made a statement during which, he seemed like he was very convinced that the Egyptian authorities will not allow the ship, the march, to go ahead to the Rafah border, because according to him, these people are extremists and the typical propaganda that they spew 24/7. Now, a couple of other things that I wanted to share with you in this live stream. Europe is, they have been selling to the population of Europe, NATO countries, that they need to support Ukraine against Russia, that Russia is a threat, and more calls coming for draft, having more people joining the army, and more risk and more escalation, despite the fact that both the Russian and the Ukrainian leadership back in 2022, just after Russia started its attack against Ukraine, they had reached an agreement for a ceasefire, an understanding between Zelensky and Putin at the time to de-escalate things and potentially have a peaceful process. Then the American administration and the British administration started to whisper in Zelensky's ear, no, don't go to a ceasefire with them. We will support you with everything that you need. Get out of the negotiations and you will have our full backing. Only for now, the United States to start taking a different position. But from a European perspective, there are certain European countries who are interested in still continuing this escalation. And there was a very interesting statement coming from the former Ukrainian foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba. Look at this article over here. British mothers have to accept that their sons will have to die for NATO. That's the former Ukrainian foreign minister. British mothers have to accept that their sons would have to die for NATO. I mean, it's for NATO. Not for freedom or liberty or independence or justice, for NATO as an organization. This was reported in multiple platforms, by the way. Former Ukrainian foreign minister Dmytro Kuleba has delivered a stark warning during the Concordia Europe 2025 summit in London. NATO's future and Europe's stability may soon hinge on whether British families are prepared to see their sons die defending alliance members like Finland, Estonia, or Poland. In an interview with Metro, Kuleba argued that if that willingness does not exist, NATO itself could collapse. According to him, the moment of reckoning is approaching. Mothers in Britain will soon have to make an unthinkable choice to send their sons to fight Russian soldiers in Europe or face the end of NATO, Kuleba said. He pointed to Russia's intensifying attacks, describing one recent drone assault as the worst Ukrainian has experienced since the full-scale war. Kuleba believes that the Russian President Vladimir Putin aims to expose the vulnerability of Europe's collective security framework and prove that NATO's Article 5 commitment, the one that promises mutual defense, is hollow. The day NATO spends debating whether or not to invoke Article 5 will be the day that the alliance ends. Again, you know, totally ignoring the fact that the NATO has been politicized and financialized, so to speak, as well, for American interests at the end of the day. American expansionism, America going against all of its agreements that it had with Russia, not to expand eastwards, going against its, well, core principle it was established upon, a defensive organization, not a hostile organization, expanding towards Russian borders, with more reports that they wanted to put Ukraine in it too, a couple of 100 kilometers away from Russia. Why? Because the aim is Russia at the end of the day. The aim is not like a defense. The aim is to control Russia. The United States wants to take control over Russia, or at least wanted to, and now it's clearly understanding that it's not going to happen. But I mean, really, the big question is for British mothers. I mean, we're going to have to leave that for British mothers. If we have some British mothers in the chat, I mean, you can, of course, share your thoughts. Are you willing to send your children to go and die for NATO or not? I don't believe that most British mothers will want to send their children to die for NATO, despite the fact that, well, we're having some attempts, by the way, from the British government to try and push for more, you know, people joining the army, and Keir Starmer having these moves. And the final thing that I wanted to talk to you about is the tensions that are happening in Los Angeles. A United States Senator, Alex Padilla, a United States Senator, a Democrat, he was trying to question Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. She was having a statement, a press briefing, and he just tried to ask a question. Now, the tensions have been rising in California. If you've been monitoring what's happening, people protesting in the streets, the American President Donald Trump sending the National Guard against the will of the California governor, potentially trying to expand it from hundreds to thousands, the National Guard, the California governor, alongside people from the legal side, taking action against the federal government for overstretching, for taking authoritative measures, and also for terrorizing the public too. Now, even the questions are becoming too much for the administration to handle. So here's what happened, and here's how Alex Padilla was detained by the FBI. Let's have a look at this video.
Sir, hands up. I'm Senator Alex Padilla. I have questions for the secretary, because the fact of the matter is a half a dozen violent criminals that you're rotating on your hands off.
On the ground. Hands behind your back. Hands behind your back.
If you let my hands go, I find behind my back.
All right. Cool. Other hand. Lay flat. Lay flat.
Other hand, sir. Other hand.
There's no recording louder.
So that's a United States senator. And if Donald Trump is treating senators who are trying to ask questions like that, I mean, where could things reach? At the end of the day, there's a growing sentiment of independence in multiple states in the United States. And that's only fueling them and fueling this hostile approach between the two parties. And the final thing that I wanted to talk to you about is, well, Israel is having, of course, conducting a genocide inside of the Gaza Strip. But today they cut off all of the communication from Gaza. One of the only things that we've seen was a massive explosion in a certain part of the Gaza Strip. But this is very dangerous. Why? Because Israel could be planning for something even worse than what it's been doing. The images that are coming from Gaza in the past few days are awful. Dystopian images. People in their thousands going and trying to get to these aid points of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that the Americans are conducting now in Gaza, trying to allow aid in, which is nothing but a complete joke. And it's a concentration camp with death traps. People in their thousands stampeding over each other, try and get a bit of food, children being massacred. We saw images today of children on the ground bleeding to death. And many of them died from their wounds after Israel was shooting them in coordination with this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And all of what they're doing is trying to get a bag of flour. And Israel's militias are stealing some of that aid too. Some of them are trying to participate with the Israeli actions against the population. But the situation is getting even worse. So whilst Benjamin Netanyahu is having these moves and in his government, and there are certain talks about an attack against Iran, the most important thing to remember is that the people are still suffering. And the people in Gaza, they don't have days to wait. They don't have even minutes or hours. Concrete measures need to be taken immediately. Therefore, it's crucially important for all of the activity to continue up until the genocide is forced to stop. And these were the main things that I wanted to share with you in this live stream. As usual, I hope I shed some light about the situation and added some beneficial information for you. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day, evening, or night, depending on where you are. Stay blessed, take care, and I will see you soon in the next video. Peace, everyone. Salam.